You wouldn't expect the scrapping of machinery to be a blessing for an enthusiast of anything mechanical, but in the 1960s and 70s, there was one scrapyard that could only be described as a blessing in disguise for those interested in steam preservation. In 1955, British Rail put into effect their plans for modernisation, with the intent of replacing their 16,000 steam locomotives with newer diesel and electric-powered locomotives. They also planned to reduce their number of freight wagons from 1.25 million down to 600,000. They started by replacing smaller shunting and branch line locomotives, but by 1958 the British Transport Commission wanted to accelerate the process of disposing of their steam locomotives. Because British Rail couldn't cut up the engines fast enough, they decided to outsource the job to scrap merchants. The Woodhams Brothers Scrapyard in Barry, Wales, was contracted with scrapping many steam locomotives that worked on the western region of British Rail, mostly engines formerly built by the Great Western Railway. They started by scrapping 10 engines and eventually got their hands on more, as well as some freight wagons. The manager of the yard eventually realised that it was quicker and more profitable to break up the freight wagons than the engines, so they turned their attention to the wagons. They still kept purchasing locomotives with the intention of breaking them up, but most of them were left in sidings to rust while attention was focused on scrapping of wagons. By 1964, the Woodham brothers had agreed to scrap several other locomotives and wagons belonging to the southern region of British Rail, formerly Southern Railways. These too were left in sidings to rust while the yard focused on breaking up wagons. Seeing an opportunity, many railway enthusiasts raised money and flocked to Barry in order to try and save as many engines as they could. The engines were sold at scrap value plus VAT and were towed from the scrapyard by British Rail to their new homes. Most of the engines in good condition were purchased, but as time went on, even engines that were corroded or rotten were saved from the cutter's torch. Because the rails in the scrapyard were part of an old freight yard, they eventually broke from the engines being shunted around, causing some of the engines to derail and others to end up with damaged wheels. After this, British Rail refused to tow the engines along the main line, and so any engines that were purchased had to be towed away from the site by road. This still didn't stop people from buying engines and spare parts from Barry, with a small organisation formed in 1979 called the Barry Steam Locomotive Action Group, to help potential buyers purchase the remaining 100 or so locomotives. The influx of interest in the engines did however cause problems for the Woodham brothers, as many people broke into their yard over the years not only to see the engines, but to steal nameplates, numbers and souvenirs from them. It got so bad that they ended up having to hire security guards to monitor the yards at night. Eventually, by 1980, most of the engines were gone, with a few left over as tourist displays or simply too rotten to restore. A total of 297 engines were sent to Barry to be scrapped, but rather remarkably, only 84 were ever actually scrapped, as a total of 213 engines were rescued from the yard. Roughly 150 of these engines were restored and have since ran again in preservation, including LMS Staniers, Southern Rail Pacifics, British Rail Standards, and many Great Western Halls, Kings, Manors, as well as a vast array of tank engines, with most of them currently out of service and awaiting overhauls. One of the engines rescued from Barry was number 5972, Alton Hall, which was rescued in 1981 and after it was restored became famous for being the engine that pulled the Hogwarts Express in the Harry Potter films. Many scrapyards focus on cutting up engines without giving them a chance to be preserved, so despite being a rather unfortunate end for some engines, the Barry Scrapyard ironically ended up being the perfect place for engines to be saved. I guess the moral of the story is, just because you're in a bad place now, doesn't mean it won't get better in the future. Subscribe for more.